I'm David Rios-Gonzalez, and I'm the producer on Your School News. This week, our news department wants to talk to you about one of the most important days in American history. Tomorrow is September 11th, marking 20 years since the horrific terror attack. On this day, 4 planes were hijacked by terrorists belonging to the organization Al-Qaeda. 2 of the planes were flown into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and another one would crash in Pennsylvania after being taken back by passengers. It is believed that this plane was going to crash into Washington, D.C. In total, 2,996 people were killed. Included in the total were the first responders. Though many of us weren't alive to see it, 9/11 marked the end of an era in the United States. You can still see it today in airports, our border policy, and many other places without realizing it. We feel that it is important to give perspective on these events. Our administration gave us the opportunity to speak to some of our faculty about what they remembered about that day and the aftermath that has changed the landscape for our country since.
I was teaching. In fact, I was standing in my classroom. We used to have a program called Channel 1 where we'd have a TV mounted in the corner and the kids would watch the news. Somehow they were able to do what we know now as live streaming, and I remember standing in front of the class. One of the towers had already been hit, but it was early in the morning, and so we just thought it was an accident. One of my students then came, drew attention to seeing the second plane flying toward the building, and we saw it crash. I remember the kids gasping, and I remember not knowing what to say. Like, what just happened? This is the second plane that hit. And then in the silence, one of my students says, oh, Miss McCoy, my birthday is ruined forever, because September 11th was his birthday. And at that point, the adults started processing oh, this was an attack. And so, again, we were scared. I think everybody was just kind of figuring out what is going on. But as a young teacher, and I think I'd only been teaching about 6 years, I think that was one of the first times in my career where I felt like I just didn't know what to do.
I was 20, and I was a junior in college just outside of Chicago, and I was just getting ready for class. I had a class, I forget what time, I think it was 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. that morning, and I got a phone call, and it was my sister, and she's like, have you heard? And we had just lost a family member, I think, the week before, so I wasn't sure, where that was going. And then she told me to turn on the news. I don't even think she said anything. And I did, and it was after the second plane had hit the Twin Towers, and I was just in shock. This moment of just being in complete and utter disbelief at what was happening, and at the same time just not even knowing. It seemed serious, but we had no idea in that moment how serious it was.
I can remember exactly where I was when it was broadcast, and my department head came over. I was standing outside my classroom. I had a math lab at that time, and I was standing there, and she said, Patty, a plane just flew into the Twin Towers. I'm like, what? She goes, there's been a terror attack. And I just remember, disbelief, shock. And immediately, way back then, we didn't have, cable and phones and all that. We had one TV in our corner, which we did announcements on, and had the 3 basic channels that they have on the regular TV. So we went into my classroom, and that's the one day we've never worked in my classroom, and we turned on that TV, and we were sitting there watching the newsreel over and over and over again. And then as we watched, that second plane flew in and hit that tower, and I'm getting goosebumps here just thinking about it. And everybody, we were just sitting there, and kids started crying, they were upset, it was a horrible, horrible day.
I was a senior in high school, and I was on Central Time, so I was actually sitting in, I think, my second period class. It was my social studies class, when the news came over the loudspeaker that there was a national disaster threat basically going on. So they had us go on, it wasn't quite lockdown because that was not quite a term yet when I was in high school, but they basically had us stay in that room until they could figure out what was going on. So in that day they would roll in the TV cart and they turned on the TV cart for us to watch that news. And I just remember people all around me just really shocked and crying, and our teacher was trying her best to hold it together, and it was just such a shocking thing for all of us. I was living in a semi-small town in Kansas at the time, and it was just such a foreign idea to us that anything like that could happen.
I was teaching at Gallatin High School. I just started my first full year teaching, and I team taught a class with another teacher, and we were standing outside of our classroom waiting for our first period to start. And a student, Scott Hitchcock, I'll never forget his name, came up to us and said, "Did you hear about the plane crash into the World Trade Center?" And my bachelor's degree is in aerospace, and I know a little bit about flying, and I thought that seems awful weird. And as we talked, and then we heard the second crash happened, I remember saying, "That's not an accident. We're under attack." I walked outside after the no-fly order came down, and I remember looking up in the sky, and I guess the history teacher in me started thinking, well, this is 2001, the Wright brothers flew in 1903, and this was the first time since the Wright brothers that there was no chance of a plane being over the United States.
It really impacted the U.S., I think, by making us think about, or making some of us, I guess, think about what's going on around the world, what's going on in other countries, the issues that other countries are facing, and why they might look to America as something to be attacked, which is not a perspective. You know, we always see our country as the hero of the story. We see our country as the one that led the way and tried to spread democracy, and not every country sees us that way. And that was something I really hadn't realized up until that point. So it was pretty eye-opening, and definitely sort of broadened my view of politics, of social issues, of travel, and just looking outside of my sphere and outside of my country to see what other people around the world were thinking and going through.
Everybody was filled with fear. We had just experienced something we had never experienced as a nation before, and I think people were scared. Airports shut down. I was teaching at a school in Indianapolis, Indiana. You saw parents coming to pick up their children. Everybody was nervous about their next moves. It was probably the first time in my adult life where I saw the country stand still. Like, even to see a city like New York that's always hustling and bustling, everybody just kind of stood still. And really, we just kind of waited to see what instructions we needed to hear in order to be able to make our next moves.
The biggest one, I guess the one that affects the most people, is the airport security that we went through for years and years after that, and still undergoing, you know, the airport security checks and all that stuff that we have to do at the airport. Take your shoes off and run your bag through a scanner, and things that we didn't have to do before. You can't say goodbye to your grandma at the plane gate anymore. You have to say goodbye to her, you know, 60 feet ahead of where she has to go through security, and that's a pretty jarring change when you're used to just walking up with them.
you can't park anywhere near important especially federal buildings anymore. They have it all blocked off. I'd been to Washington, D.C. several times and have actually driven down Pennsylvania Avenue, drive right by the White House. Well, you can't do that anymore. It's blocked off where you can't drive on the road. You have to, if you're on a tour, you have to park a little ways away and then you walk up to the White House to see it.
I've taught for the bulk of the year since 9/11, and it's been, I remember the conversations we had in the beginning, like 2 or 3 years later when I was first teaching, versus the conversations now. It's weird that where for a lot of my students now, this is just a part of a history book. You know, like when I was in high school, like the wars were part of a history book, you know, but I mean, like I lived something so big. And my students at first also lived in that too. And then every year, you know, they were like, oh, I was 8, I was 5, I was, you know, I wasn't even born is where we're at now.
I think a lot of students are desensitized to it. So unless they've been touched by the tragedy, it is kind of hard to understand. But I think that if you go back and look at the video and you see that, oh yes, this is real, this really did happen. I think the memorial each year does remind people that, you know, it can happen, it did happen, and we need to remember those that lost their lives.
It's just like learning anything about history. You got to understand it and learn it from the context of the times, and just how everything that happened after 9/11. You have the war on terror that, and we just pulled out of Afghanistan after 20 years, and we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and it just understand how we got where we are, and that was a key part of it.
It's important to be a good listener, and history is a good platform for allowing people to listen. So hearing someone else's story also kind of lets you get to know them better. So the idea is that we are all individuals that have our own personal stories, our own lives that make us who we are. So it forces you to get to know someone, which I think is really what creates unity. I think that's, as a country, that's what we learned after 9/11. No matter how divided we were at that time, 9/11 brought us together like I had never seen in my life, in my adult life, in my childhood life. Giving us the opportunity to unite, I think, is what 9/11 did. But I think the takeaway was, if we have a common goal, it's easy to be united. If we all kind of want the same thing, it's easy to kind of have that thing in common. So.
Thank you to all who participated in sharing your recollections of that day. Tomorrow marks 20 years since the attacks on September 11th. Please take some time to remember and reflect on the event that changed our worlds. Thank you for your time.